Chapter 21 of Bradford's History of the Plymouth Settlement, 1608 to 1650. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bradford's History of the Plymouth Settlement, 1608 to 1650, by William Bradford, rendered into modern English by Harold Paget. Book 2, Chapter 21. Mr. Shirley, being weary of this controversy and desirous to end it, wrote to Mr. John Atwood and Mr. William Collier, two of the inhabitants of this place, and special acquaintances of his, and desired them to be intermediaries, and advise the partners here as to some way of reaching a composition by mutual agreement. He also wrote to the partners similarly, in part as follows. James Shirley in England to Governor Bradford at New Plymouth. Sir, I have written so much concerning the closing of our accounts that I confess I do not know what more to write. If you desire an end, as you seem to do, there are, I think, only two ways. Either we can perfect all accounts, from the first to the last on both sides, or we must do it by compounding, and this way, first or last, we shall have to come to. If we fight about it at law, we shall both only cleave the air, and the lawyers will be the chief gainers. Then let us set to the work one way or another and make an end, so that I may not continue to suffer both in my reputation and my business. Nor are you free in this respect. The gospel suffers by your delay, and causes its followers to be ill spoken of. Do not be afraid to make a fair and reasonable offer. Believe me, I shall not take advantage of you, or else let Mr. Winslow come over, and let him have full power to compound with me. Otherwise, let the accounts be fully made up so that we may close according to the figures. Now, blessed be God, times are so much changed here that I hope to see many of you return to your native country again, and have such freedom and liberty as the word of God prescribes. Our bishops were never so near a downfall as now. God has miraculously confounded them, and brought down all their popish and Machiavellian plots and projects upon their own heads. I pray you take it seriously into consideration, let each give way a little so that we may meet. Be you and all yours kindly saluted. So I ever rest, your loving friend, James Shirley, Clapham, May 18th, 1641. Being urged by this letter, and also by Mr. Atwood's and Mr. Collier's mediation, to bring things to an end, and by none more earnestly than by their own desires, the New Plymouth partners took this course. They appointed these two men to meet them on a certain day, and summoned other friends on both sides, and Mr. Freeman, brother-in-law of Mr. Beauchamp. Having drawn up an inventory of all remaining stock whatsoever, such as housing, boats, the bark, and all implements belonging to them, used during the period of trading, together with the surplus of all commodities, such as beads, knives, hatchets, cloth, or anything else, both valueless and saleable, with all debts, both bad and collectible, and having spent several days upon it with the help of all books and papers, either in their hands or those of Josias Winslow, their accountant, they found the total sum on valuation amounted to £1400. They then all of them took a voluntary and solemn oath, in the presence of one another and of all their friends above mentioned now present, that this was all that any of them knew of or could remember; and Josias Winslow did the same on his part. But the truth is the valuation was too low; for, as an instance, in reckoning some cattle taken from Mr. Allerton, a cow which had cost £25 was so valued in this account, but she subsequently realized only £4 15 shillings 0 pence. Also, being conscientious about their oaths, they included all that they knew of which was owing to the stock, but they did not make such a diligent search concerning what the stock might owe them, so that many scattered debts fell upon them afterwards, which they had not charged in. However, this done, they drew up certain articles of agreement between Mr. Atwood on Mr. Shirley's behalf and themselves. Articles of agreement made and concluded on October 15th, 1641. Whereas there was a partnership for a period of years agreed upon between James Shirley, John Beauchamp and Richard Andrews, of London, merchants, and William Bradford, Edward Winslow, Thomas Prince, Miles Standish, William Brewster, John Alden, John Howland and Isaac Allerton, in a trade of beaver skins and other furs from New England, and the term of the said partnership having expired, various consignments of goods having been sent to New England by the said James Shirley, John Beauchamp, Richard Andrews, and many large returns made from New England by the said William Bradford, Edward Winslow, etc., a dispute arising about the expense incurred for 2 ships, the one called the White Angel of Bristol, and the other the Friendship of Barnstable, and a projected voyage in her, etc., which said ships and their voyages the said William Bradford, etc., consider do not concern the accounts of the partnership; and whereas the accounts of the said partnership are found to be confused, and cannot be clearly present, through default of Josias Winslow the bookkeeper; and whereas the said W.B., etc., have received all their goods for the said trade from the aforesaid James Shirley, and have made most of their returns to him, by consent of the said John Beauchamp and Richard Andrews; and whereas also the said James Shirley has given power and authority to Mr. John Atwood, with the advice and consent of William Collier of Duxbury, on his behalf, to put an absolute end to the said partnership, with all and every accounts, reckonings, dues, claims, demands, whatsoever, to the said James Shirley, John Beauchamp, and Richard Andrews, from the said W.B., etc., for and concerning the said beaver trade, and also the charge of the said 2 ships, and their voyages made or projected, whether just or unjust, from the world's beginnings to this present, as also for the payment of a purchase of £1800 made by Isaac Allerton, on behalf of the said W.B., etc., and of the joint stock, shares, lands, and adventurers, whatsoever, in New England aforesaid, as appears by a deed bearing the date November 6th, 1627, and also for and from such sum and sums of money or goods as are received by William Bradford, Thomas Prince, and Miles Standish, for the recovery of dues, by accounts between them, the said James Shirley, John Beauchamp, Richard Andrews, and Isaac Allerton, for the ship called the White Angel. Now the said John Atwood, with advice of the said William Collier, having had much communication and spent several days in discussion of the said disputes and accounts, with the said W.B., etc., and the said W.B., etc., having also with the said bookkeeper spent much time in collecting and listing the remainder of the stock of partnership for the said trade, and whatsoever has been received, or is due by the said attorneyship before expressed, and all manner of goods, debts, and dues, thereunto belonging, which in all amount to the sum of £1400 or thereabout; and for better satisfaction of the said James Shirley, John Beauchamp, and Richard Andrews, the said W.B. and all the rest of the above said partners, together with Josias Winslow the bookkeeper, have taken a voluntary oath that the said sum of £1400 or thereabout includes whatever they know, to the utmost of their remembrance. In consideration of which, and to the end that a full, absolute, and final end may now be made, and all suits in law may be avoided, and love and peace continued, it is therefore agreed and concluded between the said John Atwood, with the advice and consent of the said William Collier, on behalf of the said James Shirley, to and with the said W.B., etc., in manner and form following, viz., that the said John Atwood shall procure a sufficient release and discharge under the hands and seals of the said James Shirley, John Beauchamp, and Richard Andrews, to be delivered fair and unconcealed to the said William Bradford, etc., at or before the last day of August, next ensuing the date hereof, whereby the said William Bradford, etc., their heirs, executors, and administrators, and each of them shall be fully and absolutely acquitted and discharged of all actions, suits, reckonings, accounts, claims, and demands whatsoever, concerning the general stock of beaver trade, payment of the said £1800 for the purchase and all demands, reckonings, accounts just or unjust, concerning the 2 ships, White Angel and Friendship aforesaid, together with whatsoever has been received by the said William Bradford, of the goods or estate of Isaac Allerton, for satisfaction of the accounts of the said ship White Angel, by virtue of a letter of attorney to him, Thomas Prince, and Miles Standish, directed from the said James Shirley, John Beauchamp, and Richard Andrews, for that purpose as aforesaid. It is also agreed and concluded between the said parties to these presents, that the said W.B., E.W., etc., shall now be bound in £2400 for payment of £1200, in full satisfaction of all demands as aforesaid, to be paid in manner and form following, that is to say, £400 within 2 months next after the receipt of the aforesaid releases and discharges, £110 whereof is already in the hands of John Winthrop, Sr., of Boston, Esquire, by the means of Richard Andrews aforesaid, and £80 of beaver now deposited in the hands of the said John Atwood, to be both in part payment of the said £400, and the other £800, to be paid £200 per annum, to such assigns as shall be appointed, inhabiting either New Plymouth or Massachusetts, in such goods and commodities, and at such rates as the country shall afford at the time of delivery and payment; and in the meantime the said bond of £2400 to be deposited in the hands of the said John Atwood. And it is agreed upon, by and between the said parties to these presents, that if the said John Atwood shall not or cannot procure such said releases and discharges as aforesaid from the said James Sherley, John Beauchamp, and Richard Andrews, at or before the last day of August next ensuing the date hereof, that then the said John Atwood shall, at the said date precisely, redeliver, or cause to be delivered, unto the said W.B., E.W., etc., their said bond of £2400 and the said £80 of beaver, or the due value thereof, without any fraud or further delay, and for performance of all and each of the covenants and agreements herein contained and expressed, which on the one part and behalf of the said James Sherley are to be observed and performed, shall become bound in the sum of £2400 to them, the said William Bradford, Edward Winslow, Thomas Prince, Miles Standish, William Brewster, John Alden, and John Howland. And it is lastly agreed upon between the said parties, that these presents shall be left in trust, to be kept for both parties, in the hands of Mr. John Rayner, teacher of New Plymouth. In witness whereof, all the said parties have hereunto severally set their hands, the day and year first above written. John Atwood, William Bradford, Edward Winslow, etc. In the presence of Edmund Freeman, William Thomas, William Paddy, Nathaniel Souther. Next year this long and tedious business came to an issue, as will appear, though not to a final end with all the parties, but so much for the present. I had forgotten to insert that the church here had in 1638 invited and sent for Mr. Charles Chauncy, a reverend, godly, and very learned man, who stayed till the latter part of 1645, intending after a trial to choose him pastor, for the more convenient performance of the ministry, with Mr. John Rayner the teacher. But there appeared some differences about baptism, he holding that it ought only to be done by dipping and putting the whole body under water, and that sprinkling was unlawful. The church conceded that immersion or dipping was lawful, but not so convenient in this cold country. But they could not allow that sprinkling, which nearly all the churches of Christ use to this day, was unlawful and merely a human invention. They were willing to yield to him as far as they could, and to allow him to practice according to his convictions, and granted that when he came to administer the ordinance, he might perform it in that way for any who so desired, provided he allowed Mr. Rayner, when requested, to baptize by sprinkling. But he said he could not yield to this. So the church procured some other ministers to discuss the point with him publicly, such as Mr. Ralph Partridge of Duxbury. But he was not satisfied, so the church sent to several other churches to ask their help and advice in the matter, and with his will and consent sent them his arguments, such as to the church of Boston in Massachusetts, to be communicated to other churches there, and to the churches of Connecticut and New Haven, and many others. They received very able answers from them and other learned ministers, who all concluded against him. Their answers are too long to give here, but Mr. Chauncy was not satisfied. They considered that everything that was proper had been done, so Mr. Chauncy, who had been almost 3 years here, removed to Scituate, where he is still a minister of the church. About this time, cattle and other things having fallen greatly in value, people began to be less affluent. Many had already gone to Duxbury, Marshfield, and other places, and amongst them many of the leading men, such as Mr. Winslow, Captain Standish, Mr. Alden. Others dropped away daily, with the result that the place became far less flourishing. End of Book 2, Chapter 21.